This is a one-on-one, particularly with you. Stand by. We are up 5-4. Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Santita Jackson Show, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It is a joy to be with you in this Christmas season. And may the spirit of Christmas be with my brothers and sisters, daughters and sons of all faiths, in or out of faith. I pray that the spirit of Christmas will be with you in this holy season. Let's get right to it, everybody. Over the past year, we have discussed a lot of issues, and it just continues to get more and more engaging, more and more exciting, more and more inciting. So let's talk about Ukraine, the Middle East, and all these international issues that we've been talking with this young man about for the past several years. He is excited. He has ignited so many of you. And so I said, you know what? Let me talk with him. Because, boy, he's had quite a year himself. Of course, none other than Bryce Green, fairness and accuracy in reporting. And, of course, he's a PhD student. And I'm so glad that they let him back on campus. And he has been active in fighting for justice. Everybody, as we shift to this conversation, I want you to meet me on Blue Sky, santitajackson.bsky.social. I, of course, am on X at SantitaJ. The Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Everybody get on over there. Like me, like me, like me. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. And the Santita Jackson and Friends page. Please go to Santita Jackson and Friends. I know there's a little bug up here for Santita Jackson because that's like the landing page. But I cannot take on any more friends. I have more than 1,000 requests, but that means 1,000 other people will have to be kicked off, which is what they've been doing. I don't want to do that to anybody. Would you please go over to the Santita Jackson and Friends page? That's why it's a fan page. And then I can take everybody and we can have a good time over there. So let's get to it. I said, Bryce Green, soon to be Dr. Green, I want to do a one-on-one with you. I want to talk with you. And your old friend, Dr. David Gibbs, is going to drop in a little bit later. But I said, well, I want to talk to you. You said, oh, Santita, that's a tall order. You can handle it. If you can talk to the you and you can talk to me. There's a lot of the things that you have, the positions that you've taken on Ukraine, on the Middle East, but particularly Ukraine, initially at least were not popular. And I just want to get kind of a peek into, before I ask you about what you think of what's happening with Ukraine, just your worldview. How would you describe yourself? Because you tend to go counterculture, at least you counter the mainstream narrative, and you're very, very willing to do that. I guess I recognize that in myself. And people like us just willing to talk about it, say it out loud, and not get invited to parties, political and otherwise. But that's okay. Yeah. What has shaped your worldview?
So I'd say that I didn't get my true political awakening until sometime during, my time at university as an undergraduate. I was largely like liberal, Democrat, NPR listening kind of kid when I went into college. Mm-hmm. But what really changed, I see someone saying that there's no sound here. Is that on your end as well?
Yeah, I'm trying to say no, I can hear you.
Oh, you can.
So, Snowman, let's just keep on. Just let us know if you can hear us now. Okay, so you just continue.
Okay. I was largely like within the liberal Democratic consensus. Thought that Democrats were the good guys and Republicans were the bad guys, and even if they had problems, they were still, on the whole, better. And I still largely believe that to some extent, but I learned a lot about how both parties affect the broader issues that Americans don't talk about. Things like international trade, things like war policy, things like surveillance. All of these things are really kept out of the mainstream debate. And when I learned about all the things that were happening in my name in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, these wars that I grew up with on the evening news, not thinking too much about, thinking that, oh, well, that's horrible, but there are some good people in charge who are protecting me, and I can't possibly know the calculations that they're making. And so I trust them. But then I started reading more and more critical voices of American empire. One of them was Noam Chomsky, and reading his books on the topic. And you learn about all these horrible things that America has done, which is shocking enough. You learn about the Contra War against Nicaragua in the 80s. You learn about the overthrows of Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Iran, interventions in the Congo, Zaire, all these places around the world.
Like everywhere.
Everywhere. And it's only a slight exaggeration.
No, I'm not kidding.
Yeah. You learn about these things, and then you realize that, as a semi-educated young person, no one told me any of this. I was going around thinking that I had a reasonable political education, a reasonably well-informed worldview where I could make sense of the world through, again, watching NPR or listening to NPR, reading the Washington Post and things like that. But what was really shocking to me is that all of these things were able to be kept from me, not actively. It was all there. We all have the same internet, but the institutions that shape how you're socialized, how you're supposed to view the world, and what is considered legitimate conversation, they left out all of these things about the illegality of America's basically global empire, that there are hundreds of military bases around the world. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars to maintain and to expand. We invade countries, have constant warfare, drones buzzing around, killing who knows who, and and costing millions of lives in the Middle East. And so you learn about all that. If you're a humanist, you would think that these facts would take center stage in your worldview. Every time you read the news, it would be, how is this trillion-dollar violence machine being handled? What are they thinking about how this violence machine will be directed? Or is anyone talking about maybe stopping this violence machine? You would think that that would take center stage in all of American politics. It would be a kitchen table issue, whether or not your tax dollars are going to go towards another Holocaust or going to contribute to the largest refugee crisis since the end of World War II. But that's not a debate. That's not a debate at all. And so I started thinking, I was like, well, there's an apparatus of media in which you can be reasonably informed about the facts. There are facts that are reported in the New York Times, however much I criticize that paper. There are facts that are reported on CNN. There are facts that are reported on NPR. But the context in which you interpret those facts has been shaped throughout your entire life. And if you see something like the U.S. blocking negotiations in a conflict, in Ukraine, for example, well, if you are socialized within the Beltway consensus that shapes most of our media, then you think, well, they probably had a good reason for doing that, even if it might contradict something I previously thought. I'm not going to question the intentions of Joe Biden, Blinken, our leaders, our country as a whole, because you're not socialized to ask those questions. And if it happens again, it's so far back in your mind that you don't make the connection. That when Biden lies about something else, or when Bush lies, or Obama, or whoever lies about something, you read the press. They don't tell you that this falls in a long pattern of just overt lies that America has told the world in order to advance its geopolitical interests. They don't tell you that. They say, oh, well, this is a narrow issue, and so we can have a debate about this singular lie or mistruth or half-truth or whatever they call it. And so over time, that shapes your entire worldview. That shapes American public discourse. If you're not thinking about every instance of American foreign policy as part of a long continuum, as part of a long history of an empire, well, then you're able to justify any little thing based on the excuses that they give. They'll say, oh, well, Putin is evil. And so, well, of course we would negotiate with Putin. Of course we would give weapons to Ukraine. Of course we don't want this war to end. Putin is evil. If that's your frame, then you can be convinced of just about anything. And so what started me on my journey was looking at how the facts that are presented to us, you can put reality together based on those facts that they give you, but it takes work. It takes time. It takes energy that most people in America simply don't have. And so the default is to go with what the dominant ideological producers in the country are pushing on you. And once you realize that it's very straightforward to be able to contradict those narratives using their own sources, well, then your worldview starts to slowly change. And suddenly, this isn't a misguided country that maybe oversteps its bounds, but this is actually a very pernicious empire that persists based on propagandizing a huge number of people, especially the decision makers. We in America, they say that, oh, we don't have propaganda, but in reality, Americans are some of the most propagandized people in the world. You look at who they think is the biggest threat to world peace. It's something like Iran, which, Iran hasn't invaded a country in recent memory. Iran hasn't set up military bases with drones buzzing around, overthrowing countries. Iran hasn't done that. And yet in America, it's common. In fact, it's even expected that you believe that Iran is a major threat to world peace. But once you start breaking through the fog of the enormous propaganda apparatus that's in this country, it becomes pretty clear that America is a threat to world peace, and that the inner logics of American foreign policy are such that peace isn't desirable in so many cases, and that the goals of the people making the policy aren't necessarily the goals that they say for public consumption. And once you realize that, then this whole project becomes very dark and very, very bleak. I mean, we're just talking about some of the more bleaker aspects of this entire empire. But learning about the costs of war, and learning about the ways that war is obscured or justified in the American public mind, is essential in shaping my worldview, which is essentially, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist. I'm a socialist. I was part of Democratic Socialists of America. I believe in historical materialism as a way to interpret the world. And all of that leads me to conclude that as an American, one of the primary goals that I have is to fight back to some degree against both the propaganda and the actual political machinations of our empire.
Everybody, we're talking with Bryce Green, Fairness and Accuracy Reporting. I came across him, or should I say he was put into my field of vision and really seeped into my consciousness as I began to read his work on Ukraine, for example. That's where you and I met. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, you would light up the show because you took a view that was unpopular at the time, and I understand it because I shared it with you, that this was not going to work, that this was not, that the story that we were being sold, the story that we were being told was not quite accurate. And so what, in a nutshell, what is the Ukraine conflict about? Why have we not been able to achieve peace beyond the fact that America has made Ukraine turn down every offer of peace? Do you think we really know that?
Right. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what individual power brokers and leaders are thinking at any given time, but I think it's very straightforward when you look at the trend over all of these years, over all these decades, really, of American policy, that you can pretty easily determine a through line. There's a very good book that's out that goes over this history of Ukraine. It's called Provoked by Scott Horton. I don't know if you've heard of it. Scott's a libertarian, and some of his interpretations of some of the economic stuff in that book I would vehemently disagree with. But overall, I think it paints a good chronology of how we got here. And it's almost night and day compared to what Americans and a lot of Western audiences were being told about the conflict in the lead up to the war and after the war started. In the lead up to the war, it was around winter of 2021, where you had Russian forces amassing at the border of Ukraine. In the Western press, there was all this talk about how Vladimir Putin was vehemently opposed to the idea of a Ukrainian state, and he was willing to use military force to end that state. And we can see this because in 2014 he annexed Crimea, which is a peninsula in the Black Sea that was Ukrainian, and then Russia annexed it. And so that was just examples of Putin's Hitlerian ambitions. And so any negotiation would be a Neville Chamberlain moment. It would be appeasement. We can't appease Hitler, and so we have to support Ukraine no matter what. And when the war started, it was a validation of this worldview. It's saying, see, we told you Putin was Hitler, and then he invaded. Now, I was one of the people who didn't think he would invade for reasons we can go into, and I'm perfectly willing to admit I was wrong and why I was wrong about that. But the reason I was wrong about that was because I was looking at these other things that were going on, that the media in the coverage of Ukraine was omitting an extremely important history. And that history is that the U.S. has been in a competition with Russia since the fall of the USSR. The U.S. has been trying to ensure that Russia was unable to develop to become a rival power to the United States. And to do this, they wanted to expand NATO, the military alliance, ostensibly defensive, but its history proves otherwise. But they wanted to extend NATO to Russia's borders. And this wasn't talked about in the Western press much. And that's pretty serious omission. In 2008, our ambassador to Russia, a guy named William Burns, who is currently our CIA director, but William Burns was in Russia and he was talking to his Russian sources, his Russian counterparts, and they were pretty clear. They said, no means no. NATO expansion is a Russian red line, and in that they would never consider it an acceptable policy for Russia to have to face NATO on its borders, no matter what. And that's for a simple reason. If you have military troops on military installations on someone else's border, and you're hostile to that person, well, then they're naturally going to feel unsafe. That's a very normal thing, and this was completely omitted from the Western press. They was called, when Putin was talking about how there can be negotiations to end this crisis, the Western press described it as a non-starter. They said that any agreement that would prevent NATO from expanding to Ukraine is a non-starter because the West maintains what's called an open door policy. And that open door policy is essentially saying that sometime in the future, you can have NATO on your border. Now, as things have progressed, this has become more and more dire because weapons are being developed. Missile capabilities are being expanded to the point where in the months before the Ukraine invasion, Putin was talking to his cabinet members, and he was saying that, well, we have what I call the Ukrainian missile crisis on our hands. If NATO places missiles in Ukraine on the border with Russia, then they could reach Moscow quicker than any early warning system would be able to respond to it. What this does is completely shift the balance of power that has defined the nuclear age, that has defined the Cold War. If America is able to attack Moscow without them responding, well, then this whole doctrine of mutually assured destruction is obliterated, and that the U.S. can just blow up Russia whenever it wants. That's dangerous. No Russian would accept that, be it Putin or any other Russian leader, and that's very dangerous. And so they tried to negotiate a way out of this war. There's a great article from I think the Journal of Strategic Studies. It's called Now or Never, The Immediate Origins of Putin's Preventative War in Ukraine. And it goes over the several months before the war, where Putin is doing these diplomatic overtures, saying we have to come to an arrangement, we have to come to a deal, but the U.S. refused, and so the war happened because the U.S. refused to make a deal that would prevent expanding NATO, that would allow Ukraine to be neutral, so that it would no longer be a battleground between East and West that they could develop on their own accord. The U.S. didn't want this because they have anti-Russian sentiments. And so when the war started, this was the reason. The Putin, even in Western intelligence reports, that Putin did not make a final decision to invade Ukraine until just weeks before he actually did, which might be able to explain, why he maintained his diplomatic stance as long as he did. He said, "We can still negotiate. We can still come to an arrangement." But all of this was omitted from the Western press. The Western press framed it as good versus evil. They had the Ukrainian President Zelensky doing press tours, going to all these fancy, upscale, swanky events, generating support. In the media, they would cover Ukrainians with more sympathy than they show any other population that's being bombed or attacked. And this was deliberate, to manufacture consent in the American public for America's escalation policy in Ukraine. And as you understood, that's not a very popular opinion. People don't like it when you say that America is deliberately stopping peace. People don't like it when you say that America could do something to bring about a just resolution, but it refuses to do so. And, the image of a country invading another country is very easy to demonize in the American public. Russia has been built up as this boogeyman for decades, and Ukraine has been built up as this major ally for decades. And so Russia's invasion, which I must stress, does violate international law, and it is at its core a policy of murdering people in mass. There's no getting around that.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason that this policy has enacted wasn't because of Hitlerian ambitions. It wasn't because Vladimir Putin felt that his stature wasn't big enough. It wasn't because he wanted to recreate the Soviet Empire. It was because there are legitimate security concerns about NATO and Ukraine that if Putin ignored, he would go down in Russian history as a complete failure. He would have eliminated one of Russia's key strategic values, which is the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. And so, I've been rambling, but
no. But it's not a ramble. I think number one, and as I bring up your dear friend, Dr. David Gibbs, because I brought you all on, and boy, you all got me into lots and lots of trouble, but I'm not mad about it. The author of the Revolt of the Rich, I must say, as we talk about international affairs and just where we are, Bryce Green, America would not tolerate missiles 90 miles away in Cuba. I mean, it's just, we don't forget. I mean,
we were about to blow.
I wasn't even born then. I mean, and America was, my parents said, "Oh no, bomb shelters." Wait a minute, we were having drills because the worry was that we were going to have a nuclear war. She said, no, this was a very real thing. And it's hard for me, I'm sure maybe it's hard for you too, Bryce, to imagine that 90 miles away, we wouldn't tolerate that. And yet, as the Soviet Union fell, and then as, East and West Germany were reunited, the Soviets said, look, all we ask is that you keep no NATO expansion. Don't come this way. Don't encroach upon our borders. And that's what we've done, Bryce. I mean, if our southern borders were reinforced by a hostile power, we wouldn't tolerate it, Bryce. I'm just talking about, before I come to you, Dr. Gibbs, I'm talking about fairness. I mean, I'm talking about fairness. Because at some point, we have to get beyond our silos, whether they are party silos, partisan silos, you know, whatever the political differences are, your color silos, whatever your phenotype is, whatever it is, we have to live on this. We have to share the planet. And we cannot share it being unfair to each other. It's Bryce, it's not, this doesn't work. And it plays so poorly internationally, Bryce. Bryce Green.
No, you're exactly right, and you know this comparison to having missiles in Mexico and how America would never tolerate it, or having missiles in Cuba and how America would never tolerate it. This was discussed in the '90s before they began officially expanding it. It was a common talking point among people who were cautious about the expansion of NATO and American military influence. This was discussed. One of the architects of the Cold War, actually a guy named George Kennan, who was one of the top diplomats, well respected. He was in his 90s when the Soviet Union fell and they were talking about NATO expansion. And he has a line that I think is extremely prescient. He said, if we expand it, I'm paraphrasing, but this is what he said. He said, if we expand NATO, it will inflame nationalist feelings in Russia, and Russia will eventually react badly. And then Russia will react, and then the people who expanded NATO will say that this is always how Russia is, but they would be incorrect to do so because Russia was never threatening anybody. This is what he said to the New York Times back in 1998, I believe. And exactly what he predicted is exactly what happened. That we provoked Russia into an invasion, and then we said that, oh, this just proves how awful Russia has always been. And it's not about whether or not we can find some form of coexistence. It's not about whether or not we can have unified development so we can tackle some major global problems together. You know, we have climate change looming. We have, a health crisis looming. We could tackle this together as a human race if we were any sort of intelligent. But the people in charge seem to have opted for eternal confrontation, eternal war, global dominance at any cost. And that's how we led to this war. And that's how we might lead to the next one. The same thing that's happening in Ukraine. I mean, the details are different, but mostly the same thing is happening in Taiwan right now with respect to China. And the U.S. is sending weapons to Taiwan, claiming that they're a separate country, even though official U.S. policy says it's one country, China. They're doing this. China's saying, don't do this. If you keep meddling here, there will be war. They said it explicitly. When Biden went to go visit Xi Jinping told him, we are willing to go to war over this. Please stop. What has the U.S. done? How have they responded? By continuing to send weapons, by continuing to badmouth China in public. You have Trump's trade war that is supported by the Democrats, even if there might be Democratic media who criticize it. It's all supported. In fact, this traces back to Obama, who during his second term, he initiated what's called the pivot to Asia, where instead of focusing on dominance in Central Asia, the Middle East, we had to worry about the rising tiger of China, because their GDP, by the end of Obama's term, their GDP in terms of purchasing power parity was larger than America's GDP. And that freaked out the establishment who want to maintain American dominance. And the same establishment are the people who are pushing for NATO expansion. The same establishment are the people who are supporting Israel in their genocidal war. The same establishment are supporting economic policies that impoverish the American worker. I mean, it's the same inner logics, the same organizations, the same people in some cases who are pushing all of these destructive policies. And if Americans don't wake up to that, well, they're going to one day be waking up to a mushroom cloud, or their lives are going to slowly deteriorate until the country that they thought they knew is but a figment of their imagination.
Well, Dr. David Gibbs, The Revolt of the Rich. Well, that's a wonderful place for you to come in. That's your portal. Very hopeful. But I wonder where we are, where Americans are in terms of our thinking. I don't know if we really realize, Dr. David Gibbs and Bryce Green, soon to be Dr. Green, I don't think we really understand how this impacts us internationally, not just how people feel about us, but if they want to do business with us. If we are really sparking the rise of BRICS. I mean, a lot of countries with whom we might have been tenuously allied are joining the BRICS nations. I mean, of course, our U.S. State Department really tried to stop Gaddafi in creating the United States of Africa. It seems like that is happening, Bryce and Dr. Gibbs, anyway. It's just taking a little bit longer, but it's happening. So I mean, because I met you all several years ago now. The conflicts have not abated; they've gotten worse. Ukraine has worsened. The Middle East has worsened and expanded. The Congo is a growing conflict. I don't even know where to begin, Dr. Gibbs. What is going on here? And we're running out of money to print to pay for all of this.
Historically, there have been periods when military spending was low since 1945. And when that has happened in the past, what you got is an immense lobby led by vested interests, beginning with the military industrial complex, to quote unquote correct the problem and raise military spending. One such period was the early 1990s after the end of the Cold War, and you had a significant decline in military spending that was a response to the fact that the US had no enemies. Colin Powell had an interview with the Stars and Stripes in 1990, and he said, think hard about it. I'm running out of demons. I'm running out of villains. We're down to just Cuba and North Korea, he said. And the American elite, I think, was very concerned about the fact that the US didn't have any really formidable enemies. And there really was a search for enemies. There was an important document in 1992 called the Defense Planning Guidance Document, which foresaw the possibility of China and or Russia becoming a new post-Cold War enemy, almost with a hopeful tone that maybe this will solve our problem and give us the enemy we need. And of course, the interests behind this were military manufacturers and the uniformed military, that cluster of forces, known as the military-industrial complex, but also, I think, more broadly, the foreign policy establishment, the think tanks, the academics, outposts in the mass media, and so on, that have benefited from the Cold War. All of these interest groups wanted a new enemy. And if you look for a new enemy hard enough, you will find a new enemy. And that's in effect what we've done here. Russia was not an enemy state. They were very friendly to the United States. Putin himself came to power in 1999, 2000, wanted better relations with the West, including the United States and also Germany. He offered to join NATO. He wanted to join. First, the Russians were very angry about NATO expansion because it violated the 1990 agreement not to expand NATO into the former communist states of Eastern Europe. That's a touchy issue, but we have the documents available. They're available to a website at George Washington University that the US made an agreement and then violated it. But it seems Putin decided if you can't beat them, join them. And so he offered to join NATO as a member state, just to ensure there would be positive relations, and this was refused. Putin's offer to join NATO and become a US ally was refused. And so,
why was it refused?
I think we needed an enemy. NATO is a military organization. It's not just something, an excuse to expand the military-industrial complex. It has to have an enemy. That's the whole purpose of NATO, is to defend against an enemy. And if Russia were to join NATO, there'd be no credible enemy to defend Europe against.
But wait. Do we really grasp that concept? That's what NATO does? I mean, because I've read your writings about this down through the years, and even Eisenhower said this is a 10-year project. And if we are still needed in 10 years, then we would have been a failure, and we've got to deconstruct this and come up with something else. So when Trump said in 2016, we need to end NATO, and people got all over him, my progressive friends were angry with me because reflexively they're angry with him. I said, whoa. I've been to Brussels, okay? I've seen their headquarters. I've seen them over there. What are we doing? We're just doing wars, Dr. Gibbs. That's what they do.
I do want to point out that there was a time during the Cold War when opposition to NATO was a progressive thing. The far left favored that position, whereas now it's seen as a right-wing position. I think it does reflect something of a reorientation, realignment in U.S. politics. Also, hostility to the CIA and the FBI is now coded as right-wing, whereas in my day, when I was in college and graduate school, that was left-wing. And so it's
Before you go any further, how did this happen? How is it that I'm now branded someone who's a closet right winger? Me.
well, I don't have a good explanation for that, but it has definitely happened. I think one of the things you did have is that you had a certain demonization of Russia as socially conservative, that Russia is negative on gay rights. It is somewhat negative on gay rights, and I don't like that, frankly. And it's seen as socially traditionalist, and therefore the American, traditionalist right has had some degree of sympathy for Putin's positions, and so the left has naturally gravitated against that. But to me, that's very superficial. I mean, again, I don't agree.
And there was the Russiagate thing.
Of course, naturally, the Russiagate thing, that obviously was a way of not only justifying Hillary Clinton's loss of the election, rather than acknowledging the fact that she was a lousy candidate who ran a lousy campaign. They had to come up with some boogeyman. The boogeyman was Russia. And it was also a good way to basically come up with a new enemy. And I have to say, during Russiagate in 2016, my first reaction was, this is so ridiculous. Nobody's going to take it seriously. And then when it was clear I was wrong about that and people were taking it seriously, my next inclination was to say, I've got a funny feeling somebody wants a war with Russia. It looked like they were laying the propaganda groundwork for a war with Russia. That's how it looked in 2016 to me. And here we are. And so I do think that was part of the agenda. I think in a larger sense, what was going on here was, in the first place, there was the political ideological issue of the Democrats needed to explain losing to somebody who should have been a joke and a clown. And they had to explain that. But I think the larger issue was, the military-industrial complex needed a justification and needed an enemy. But also, the specific one was that, indeed, the United States was being threatened by the rise of China, that China clearly was suppressing the United States, at least by one measure, the PPP measure, in gross domestic product, and was clearly on the road to overtaking fully the United States in terms of economic supremacy. And there was a lot of anxiety about that in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And so I think in terms of confronting Russia and starting a war with Russia, provoking a war with Russia, which is exactly what we did, the agenda was to defeat Russia, not so much on the battlefield, but through sanctions. The plan was to make the ruble into rubble, as Biden so colorfully put it, and thereby knock Russia out of the game, of the great power game, deprive China of a key ally and also a shot across the bow to China. If we can defeat Russia this way, we can defeat you too. Don't mess with us. That's what I think was going on here. It was the idea was that if we could defeat Russia, there'd be a natural gravitating to the United States, the bandwagon effect, as it's called among students of international relations. Countries would bandwagon with the United States as the winner in this great war with Russia, as the defeater of Russia. Russia would be turned into a vassal state. We do a regime change. And we either would impose somebody of our choice, more independent than Putin, or possibly break up Russia. That was also being discussed. And either way, it would be a glorious victory. It would reestablish the United States as the primary country, the only real superpower, intimidate other challengers like China, and make sure that, and also Biden would go down in history as one of the greatest presidents, the greatest foreign policy president since Harry Truman. I have no doubt that's how he saw this whole thing playing out. As I said but many times, I really don't think Biden was that interested in anything other than foreign policy. Mm-hmm. He wanted this to be his legacy. And also would unite the country behind a great crusade. All the cultural divisions over woke and all that kind of thing, that would go away because we'd have this great foreign policy crusade like the Cold War and victory. And, we'd have victory. And it all went very badly, obviously. There was a lot of wishful thinking here. And there's no question, the Russian economy in the first place has done very well, or relatively well. It is the highest GDP growth rate of any European country, at least any major European country. I think Bulgaria might be a little higher, but it's higher than the United States in 2024. It's much higher than Germany or Britain or France. And so the economy hasn't done badly at all. They've reoriented their trade. They've reoriented their financial system. And on the battlefield, they are set to win. Now, it's an ugly victory. It's an ugly victory because hundreds of thousands of people will have died that shouldn't have died. The whole invasion was ugly and a violation of international law. Bryce is certainly right on that point. But it was something the U.S. provoked. The U.S. could have prevented this if it had taken Russian security interests into consideration, if it had taken into consideration the fact that the United States would never allow Russia to establish a military alliance with Mexico. And that's, in effect, what the U.S. was doing with Ukraine. And the U.S. should have had an understanding of that. And I think the attitude was that we didn't have to have an understanding of that because we could simply defeat the Russians. Because we did have an image of the Russians as losers. It was, as John McCain put it, a gas station masquerading as a country. That was the U.S. attitude. We regarded the Russians as losers. And so we had no respect for them. And we could simply defeat them economically. And that's the way it would be done. And it's all gone very badly. This is, in fact, going to be a Russian victory and a NATO defeat. It's going to have a very negative effect on NATO's credibility and U.S. credibility. And as you noted, it's leading to the rise of the BRICS. Basically, it's a counter-hegemonic alliance, a counter-NATO, one might say, that ultimately is going to, in the future, dethrone the United States as the dominant power.
Well, it's counter the Western world. I mean, and there are so many reasons for that. I mean, when Dr. David Gibbs, Bryce Green, when you look at colonialism, it cannot be lost on anyone that these are the former nations who have been colonized by the West, who have found common cause. And this has been a movement that has been afoot for decades.
Could I just cut in there and just note that, again, if you look at the countries that are the American alliance, it's the old imperialist alliance. It's exactly that. It's everybody. It's all the imperialist countries from the 19th century. And the language and tone has a lot of similarities to colonialism. They don't use the term the civilized world, but there's I think an undertone of that is what I'm hearing. This is the civilized world.
Maybe it's just me. I'm not just going to say I'm hypersensitive. I was raised to decode.
Yeah, that's right. No, there's definitely a lot of coded language reminiscent of colonialism here. And I think even if we don't recognize it in the United States, and maybe they don't even recognize it in Europe, I think they do recognize it in places like South Africa and Brazil and India. And I think that's part of what is going on here, is you are getting basically a sense that the United States and the European and Japanese allies basically should not be able to dictate what goes on in the rest of the world. And you're getting a bit of a revolt by the rest of the world. And what's really giving this energy is the fact that the United States and NATO are about to lose a war. And losing a war is a very big deal for great power. It's a very good way for a great power to lose credibility, which is what is happening here.
When you lose credibility, do you lose power?
Certainly. Credibility is power to some degree. The fact that basically people respect you and fear you. The United States will be much less respected and even to some extent a little less feared than before. And, countries will have choices. In the past, in the early 90s, it was, the United States could say it's our way or the highway. The only country that matters, and you have to do what we say or face the consequences. That's not quite so true anymore, because now you have China, which is just as powerful, or by some measures more powerful. And you're getting a new organization called the BRICS, which are creating new opportunities for countries that do not want to go along with the US-led alliance and do not want to go along with its dictates, either with regard to economics or foreign policy.
Well, you can see what's happening with the Francophone countries, Bryce and Dr. Gibbs.
Yes.
They have told America to leave. When you talk about the smash up in Afghanistan, we said, well, we need a couple more months to get out. They said, no, you have until the end of the month. Yeah, I know it's less than a week away, but you got to get out of here. I you saw people grabbing on the plane wings. No. And all of you collaborators, well, anyone who's left behind, and I'm not trying to disparage anyone, but I'm saying this is the view that's on the ground, as John Walsh is saying that WCPT Chicago tagline, because facts matter. Santita show tagline should be because GOP Putin misinformation matters. No, that's not it. What we're trying to help you to see is you've been propagandized, Bryce.
No, it's exactly true. I mean, the fact that This is what I was talking about earlier. The fact that when presented with these facts, the it's common for Americans to simply respond that this is propaganda. They don't investigate, they don't read a book, they don't say, well, how did my worldview compare with this? What facts are they bringing? They just reject it all as propaganda. And that's how this sort of empire is able to persist. That's how this. Oh, I mean, you were talking about like a neo-colonialism. I mean, I called it the white power alliance, essentially, and that it's all of these white countries uh, teaming up against their former subjects. If you look at a map of the countries that are in favor of American policy on a number of issues versus a map of countries that are opposed to it, it looks like, and it's the same map every single time. It's Europe, Australia, USA, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and Israel. And maybe you get some Pacific Islands occasionally, but this is what Western commentators talk about when they talk about the world. They'll say the world is behind American policy in Ukraine. Well, it means those countries.
The
And
G7 nations. I'm like, are you serious? I mean,
exactly.
you're not even counting. 4/5 of the world is not even here. I mean, and it's actually a bigger percentage. What are you talking about?
Exactly. It omits China. It omits India. It omits Africa. It omits everybody who's dissenting against American primacy in the Middle East. It omits Latin America. Well, that's basically the entire world's population. The BRICS bloc represents a far greater share of the world's population than the G7 bloc, than the white power alliance that we're talking about. But again, it's such an important part of mainstream media to obscure that fact.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, and let me respond to John. He said, calling yourself an independent Democrat, which I am, gives you cover for you and your guests to trash Dems all day using GOP Putin misinformation. But let me tell you something. I grew up in Chicago under Richard Daley. Remember, Richard Daley's nickname was Boss. Boss Daley organized Chicago down to the block. Boss Daley was the most powerful mayor in modern American political history. Boss Daley ran Dr. King out of town. When Dr. King was here, he said, "These are the meanest white people I've ever seen in my life." This is a horror story known as Chicago. Boss Daley and J. Edgar Hoover sanctioned the murder of Fred Hampton. The Red Squad, who killed Fred Hampton, sent someone who we knew by name to kill my father. He was my Uncle Howard. He used to drive my father around Chicago all the time. He was part of the security team. Please don't lecture me about the Democrats. This is about power. Okay, John? I don't fall in love with parties. I need parties to fall in line with my agenda. Government is supposed to assist me, and I am supposed to assist it. Yes, no, please say what you will.
I was just going to add that one of the things, again, as part of the very disturbing realignment we've had ideologically in the last 10 years is McCarthyism. The idea of attacking people who dissent on foreign policy as agents of foreign governments, as traitors and so on. This used to be the province of the Republican extreme right, associated with people like Joseph McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover, and it had long been associated with that right-wing faction of the Republican Party. It has now migrated to the Democrats. And what I see is the Democrats have now completely assumed the McCarthyite mantle and the Hooverite mantle, Hooverian mantle here. And we're getting this kind of language repeatedly, that any dissent in foreign policy means you're an agent of a foreign government. Hillary Clinton, I think, helped engineer this. Again, there are lots of nasty things one can legitimately say about Donald Trump, but a puppet of Putin. Okay, that's McCarthyism. That's classic McCarthyism. All right. And that is exactly what we're seeing in the Democratic Party now and over the last 8 years. And it reflects very poorly on the party. It hasn't done them anything to gain votes. They've lost elections repeatedly based upon this. scurrilous behavior. And it's also both parties now are a threat to democracy, in my view. The Republicans, they're a threat
Absolutely.
to see, but the Democrats too are a threat to democracy. And this use of McCarthyism is a good example of a deeply undemocratic and authoritarian tendency.
From both directions. I mean, and power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And you see it, fascism generally gets a friendly face from the left. Fascists are populists. We have to be careful. But I grew up in a democratic city. And the Democrats, quite frankly, were always hostile to progressives. They still are. They're talking about bringing Rahm Emanuel back as mayor. This is someone who said that 25% he was going to close these black schools, which he did, elementary and high school. He said because 25% of these black and brown kids wouldn't make it anyway. He looked, Karen Lewis, may she rest in peace, the head of the Chicago Teachers Union, and said that. Laquan McDonald, this boy was a child. 16 shots in a cover-up so he could become mayor again? What? John, you got to do better than that. No. And God bless WCPT. I love them. And I appreciated the time that I was there. But clearly, ideologically, they took issue with me. And I'm fine with that. But I'm not going to be a slave to any party. I don't do slavery well. What I will do is I will work with you. And I expect you to work with me. But you will treat me as an adult. Period. That's it. And these kids, Bryce's age, Dr. Gibbs, Bryce, I'm not going to speak for you. You have moved away from all of these parties. You just want the country to work. That's Bryce. We only have a few minutes left here, but your thoughts?
The thing about my generation is that you're right. This generation, more than any other, is being exposed to narratives that are critical of these mainstream tendencies that get us into these wars, that get us into these imperial debacles, and I think that's a cause of hope. The reason that the American empire is able to persist in the way that it is because, unlike in purely authoritarian systems, which you can just beat people, throw them in jail if they dissent, in America, in a democracy, there is much more reliance on persuasion and propaganda, and not necessarily misinformation, but also all the ways in which you can push a population to conform with your ideas without having to use overt violence. Well, over the years, this is both a good and bad trend, is that people my age are starting to be socialized outside of these hegemonic institutions. Now, I don't know whether or not this will end up over an overall good for our generation. I mean, we understand the power that tech has over people when Google or Facebook or Apple is manipulating the algorithms that shape your worldviews. But at least for now, it's opened a door to some counter-hegemonic narratives. Now, the only thing that will allow us to capitalize on that is if we're able to use this momentum, use this new information space that we have to build institutions, build organizations that are able to contend with these hegemonic institutions that dominate American policy, that dominate the world in a realistic sense. And we're seeing that. These student protests that I was a part of and that I was arrested at are one of many fronts of resistance to this sort of policy on the home front. This policy isn't going to change because people just wish it, because a lot of people are posting, a lot of people are upset about it. It'll change because a lot of people get up and do things. And getting up and doing things is something that's been lost in a lot of different generations. The generation above me, generations before me, especially at my university, they had sat back and watched military funding take over, watched the corporatization of the university slowly dominate and push out other worldviews. But it's only now that people are starting to, stand up and say, no, I can take control of the future. I can do something about this. The quote about the arc of history bending towards justice, it's often misused because the arc of history doesn't bend towards justice because there's some magical cosmic goodness that transcends reality. It bends towards justice because people rise up and forcibly bend it that way. And I think I'm pretty hopeful that we're starting to see something like that now.
Well, history doesn't just happen. You make it happen.
Exactly.
My father said, time is neutral. It's what you do with it. So, and John, I appreciate you. That having been said, the world has changed. You've got Luigi Mangione. People are contributing to his jail fund so he can get snacks and such. People are not celebrating murder. People are being denied health care coverage. We can't miss that part. And now the corporatocracy is shook. Because a young white man from those privileged backgrounds went off. So you would think that they were transporting a member of Al Qaeda from Pennsylvania to New York. I've not seen anything like it. I said, really? Oh. Pay attention to the signs. Dr. Gibbs, you want to close us out?
Yeah, sure. Well, it is important to recognize that one of the effects these wars are having also is very bad for the American public. We shouldn't look at the issue of the war in Ukraine as one as the United States against Russia, but it's the U.S. military-industrial complex against Russia in this case. And it's the public that's paying the price. We're paying the price in terms of massive waste of funding. Hundreds of billions of dollars have gone to Ukraine and also to Israel as well. It has raised food prices and energy prices and lowered living standards. It has had all sorts of very negative effects on America's working class. And this is going to be one of the worst legacies of the Biden-Harris presidency. And I suspect it contributed to their electoral defeat. Because this war has not been popular. And my hope is it will serve as a lesson to American elites to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. And we won't get a repeat of this disaster.
Well, I think the fact is we can all grow together. John, I appreciate you and your voice, and I value the fact that you come on to this show and listen to us, even though there's clearly there are points of disagreement. But we should be able to disagree without being disagreeable, and we don't need to call names, and we don't need to mistrust our motives. I'm from a family who have committed their lives to public service. I've had not one, but two brothers who served in the U.S. Congress. I've had a father who's run for president. They were writing in some People's Encyclopedia, two of our U.S. senators, I think two of them, said they were talking to my father. They were on the Capitol and he was about to go outside and they saw the Secret Service lift the bulletproof vest and affix it to him and then lift the coat. Because my father's a big guy and the coat weighed about 50 pounds. It was bulletproof. And they said it occurred to us that this man is running for president and yet he is wearing a bulletproof vest and a bulletproof coat. And even then the Secret Service said, well, a headshot, what can we do? And then after a point, my father took all that stuff off. He said, if they get me, they get me. But I'm going to keep on going. And I'm going to keep on going. I'm not incurring that kind of risk. But we've got to save the country, everybody. And we're not going in the right direction. We're not. And we've got to do not better. We've got to do right. If you go around the world and listen to people talk about the United States, it will break your heart. Because we are hemorrhaging respect and goodwill. That is not why my grandfathers went into the Second World War, against their own misgivings as they were being lynched through the South. Many Americans had misgivings about going into the Second World War for many reasons. We need to understand what we're doing. So, most of us don't even know Putin's positions beyond the fact that he's socially conservative. We still think it's an atheist state and they're conservative Christians now. I mean, come on, everybody, really. Stop. Let's do right. Put The Revolt of the Rich under your Christmas tree. Get that book by Dr. David Gibbs. I know you always smile and laugh. I can't wait for Bryce Green to get his book out. Because you know what?
One day.
Yeah, but in the meantime, we can read you on fair. Where else can we catch you, Bryce Green?
I appreciate your writings, and fair, Bryce. They're excellent.
Absolutely brilliant. But I appreciate yours, Dr. Gibbs, too.
Thank you.
Yes, certainly.
Where else can we catch you, Bryce Green?
I'm trying to publish more on my Substack, which is just Bryce Green's newsletter. I'm still submitting articles to Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. I had an article published earlier this year at Electronic Intifada, and I sometimes appear on the American Exception podcast.
Well, we're going to catch you and support you all the way. I saw you with Mr. Galloway over in the UK. Love it.
Oh, yes.
I'm glad that he appreciates your brilliance. All right, everybody, sending you so much love. Let's talk about the post office. Will they privatize it? What will that do to our middle class, particularly the Black middle class? Part of the foundation of the Black middle class are these postal jobs. I know both my grandfathers. That was their way into the working middle class. What's going to happen as it is being dismantled as we speak? You can't make this stuff up. More of the Santita Jackson Show in just a couple minutes here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota.